I spent the better part of a summer trying to make planks out of a white oak log I had dropped in my yard. I set up my chainsaw mill, ran it through, and ended up with boards that looked fine on the surface, but cracked and split in ways I could not predict. Some of them warped so badly within a week that I could not flatten them on my bench. And it frustrated me because I knew the wood was good. That tree was straight, healthy, and over 80 years old. The problem was not the tree. The problem was me. I was cutting across the grain instead of working with it. Then I started reading about how Viking shipwrights turned raw logs into the planks that built longships. These were vessels that crossed the North Atlantic in open water, and the planks that made up their hulls were not sawn. They were split, every single one. No saw touched them. When I finally tried their methods on a similar oak log, the difference was so dramatic that I actually stood there in my yard shaking my head. The wood opened up clean, the grain ran unbroken from end to end, and the planks flexed without cracking. Today, I am going to walk you through the 5 methods Viking shipwrights used to turn a raw log into finished planks, step by step, and I promise you, by the end of this, you will be able to do it yourself with tools you probably already own. Plus, stick around for a bonus tip near the end. I learned a trick from a Scandinavian boat builder for reading the end grain of a log that tells you exactly where your split is going to travel before you ever pick up an axe. Let us get into it. What we are really talking about today is a complete system, not just one trick, but a sequence of 5 methods that work together to take a round log and turn it into flat, strong, flexible planks using nothing but hand tools and gravity. This is not a history lesson for its own sake. These techniques produce stock that is genuinely superior to what comes off a sawmill, and once you understand why, you will never look at a log the same way again. So let me give you some context first, because understanding where these methods come from helps explain why they work so well. The Viking Age ran roughly from the late 700s through the mid-1000s. During that period, Scandinavian shipwrights built some of the most seaworthy wooden vessels the world has ever seen. The Gokstad ship, pulled from a burial mound in Norway in 1880, was built around 890, and it is still structurally sound. The Oseberg ship dates to around 820. These vessels were designed to flex in open ocean swells rather than fight them, and that requirement shaped every single decision the builders made, starting with how they produced their planks. Here's the key thing to understand. These shipwrights did not have pit saws or frame saws large enough to rip a log into boards, but even if they had, they would not have used them. A saw cuts across wood fibers. It severs them. A split follows the fibers. It separates them intact. That means a riven plank has continuous grain running its entire length, unbroken from one end to the other. And continuous grain is what gives wood its ability to flex under load without snapping. That is why a longship could ride North Atlantic swells that would have broken a vessel built with sawn planks. The guiding principle behind everything I'm about to show you is simple. The tree already contains the planks. Your job is not to force them out. Your job is to find them and release them. Every method that follows comes back to that idea. Now, the first method is learning to read the log, and this is where most people skip ahead and pay for it later. Before you ever pick up a tool, you need to know what that log is going to do when you split it, and the log will tell you if you know where to look. The first thing I check is the bark. On most trees, the bark has a slight spiral pattern to it. You can see it if you step back and look at the trunk from about 10 feet away. If that spiral is gentle, maybe a few degrees over the length of the log, you are in good shape. The grain inside is running mostly straight. But if the bark spirals hard, that grain is twisted, and when you try to split it, the plank is going to corkscrew apart on you. Set that log aside for firewood. The second thing I check is the end grain. If you have a fresh cut end, look at the growth rings. You want rings that are relatively evenly spaced and running in consistent concentric circles. If you see rings that are bunched tight on one side and wide on the other, that is reaction wood. The tree was leaning or stressed, and that tension is locked into the fibers. It will cause your split to dive unpredictably. Now, species matters enormously here. White oak is the gold standard for riving. The grain is straight, the wood is strong, and it cleaves beautifully when green. Ash is another excellent choice. It splits clean and easy. Red cedar and sweet chestnut both rive well, but elm will fight you every inch of the way because the grain interlocks. Sycamore is similar, and most tropical hardwoods have such interlocked or irregular grain that riving is not practical. One more thing about reading the log: a clean, knot-free section of trunk between 8 and 12 feet long and at least 14 inches in diameter will typically yield 8 good planks if you split it radially into eighths. A larger log, say 20 inches or more, can give you 16 planks split into sixteenths. The Vikings would assess an entire tree before felling it, choosing only those with long, branch-free trunks. They were selecting their planks while the tree was still standing. Once you have confirmed your log is straight-grained and sound, you move to the second method, which is radial splitting. This is the heart of the whole system, and the geometry behind it is what makes riven planks so much stronger than sawn ones. You always start by splitting the log in half, right down the center. You are dividing it through the pith, the very core of the tree. Then you take each half and split it in half again, giving you quarters. Then each quarter gets split in half, giving you eighths. You are working like a pie, always splitting through the center point, always dividing symmetrically. Here is why this matters. When you split radially, each plank comes out as a wedge-shaped section. The growth rings run more or less flat across the face of that wedge. In lumber terms, this is quarter-sawn orientation, and it is the most dimensionally stable and strongest way a plank can be cut. The grain runs across the face rather than arcing through it, which means the plank resists cupping, resists warping, and flexes evenly along its length. Compare that to what happens at a sawmill. A plain sawn board has the grain arcing through the thickness of the board. That arc is what causes cupping as the wood dries. It is what creates weak points where the grain runs out the face. A riven plank does not have that problem because you never severed the grain in the first place. Every fiber runs continuously from one end to the other, and the radial orientation means those fibers are stacked in the strongest possible arrangement. The Vikings understood this intuitively. A longship plank needed to bend along the curve of the hull without cracking, and it needed to hold iron rivets without splitting out. Radial riving gave them both properties in every single plank. When I made my first set of radially split planks from that white oak in my yard, I could flex a plank that was only 3/4 of an inch thick into a curve that would have snapped a sawnboard of the same dimensions. That was the moment I understood why these shipwrights never bothered with saws. One important detail: always split the halves while the wood is green. Freshly felled wood splits far more easily and predictably than seasoned wood. The moisture in the fibers acts as a lubricant, and the cells have not yet stiffened. If your log has been sitting for a few months and the ends are checked, you can still work it, but expect more resistance and less predictability. Quick thing before we move on. Everything I'm sharing today comes from years of studying how the old shipwrights built, and I have gathered the best of what I have found into a book called Secrets of the Shipyard. 16 chapters, 25 hand-drawn illustrations, 150 pages of real craftsmanship knowledge. Scan the QR code on screen or hit the link in the description if you want to take these lessons off YouTube and into your shop. Now, back to what I learned. The third method is understanding the tools and the sequence you use them in, because the order matters as much as the tools themselves. You start the split with an axe, not a felling axe and not a hatchet, a heavy splitting axe or a maul, something with a thick wedge-shaped head that is designed to push wood apart rather than cut into it. You stand the log on end if you can, or lay it on the ground supported so it will not roll, and you strike right down the center of the end grain. You are not trying to chop through the log. You are starting a crack. One solid blow, maybe two, and you should see the wood begin to open. Once that crack is started, you switch to wedges. And here is where the Vikings were clever. They used wooden wedges first, carved on site from the same species they were splitting, or from a harder wood, like beech. These are called gluts. A glut is just a thick wooden wedge, typically about 8 to 10 inches long, maybe 3 inches wide at the fat end, tapering to a blunt edge. You drive a glut into the crack with a large wooden mallet called a beetle. Why wood instead of iron? 2 reasons. First, a wooden glut grips inside green wood far better than a smooth iron wedge. The fibers of the glut mesh with the fibers of the log and hold position. An iron wedge in wet wood can spit right back out at you. Second, wooden gluts are gentler on the split. They spread the force over a wider area and are less likely to bruise the fibers along the split face, which matters when that face is going to become the surface of your finished plank. You set your first glut near the starting crack and drive it in until the split extends a few inches further. Then, you set a second glut further along the split line and drive that one. Then a third. You are walking the split down the length of the log, leapfrogging wedges as you go. Once the split is running well and the log is opening up, you can switch to iron wedges for more force if you need them. But the initial work is best done with wood. I will be honest, the first time I tried this, I used iron wedges from the start, because that is what I had. 2 of them shot out of the crack, like they were launched from a cannon. Switched to wooden gluts, and everything settled right down. The old shipwrights knew what they were doing. Now, the fourth method is the one that separates someone who has read about riving from someone who has actually done it. This is steering the run, and it is where the real craft lives. Here is the problem. When you split a log, the crack does not always run perfectly straight. It has a natural tendency to wander toward the thinner side of the split. Think about it this way. When the log opens, one half is always slightly thicker or stiffer than the other. The crack follows the path of least resistance, which means it curves toward the weaker, thinner side. If you let it run uncorrected, you end up with one thick plank and one paper-thin one, or worse, the thin side breaks off entirely, and you have ruined the piece. The Vikings corrected this by flexing the thicker half. You grab the thicker side of the split, the side the crack is running away from, and you bend it forcefully toward the crack. This redirects the stress and pulls the split back towards center. At the same time, you reposition your wedge so it is driving force toward the thicker side rather than straight down. It sounds simple, and the principle is simple, but doing it well takes practice. I ruined 3 or 4 sections of perfectly good oak before I got the feel for it. The key is to watch the crack as it travels. You can actually see it start to veer. The moment you notice it drifting, you correct immediately. Do not wait. The longer a split runs off course, the harder it is to bring back. There is also a point where you have to admit a split has gone too far offline and abandon it. If the crack has wandered more than an inch or so off-center over a 4-foot run, you are better off starting a new split line than trying to wrestle it back. The Vikings wasted nothing. A plank that split off-center just became a narrower plank for a different part of the ship. The 5th method is dressing the plank, and this is where a rough, wedge-shaped split becomes a smooth, even-thickness board ready for use. You start with a side axe. This is a specialized axe where the handle is offset from the blade, and the blade is flat on one side and beveled on the other, like a giant chisel. You lay your Riven plank flat and work the side axe along the high spots, shaving the surface down toward your target thickness. The flat side of the blade rides against the plank like a reference face. You are not chopping. You are paring, taking long, controlled strokes that follow the grain. Once you have the plank roughed to near even thickness, you switch to an adze. The adze is swung downward between your feet as you straddle the plank, and it scoops shallow hollows across the surface. This evens out the humps the side axe left and brings the plank to a consistent thickness within maybe 1/8 of an inch. Finally, you finish with a draw knife on a shaving horse, pulling long ribbons of wood and bringing the surface to a smooth, clean finish. The result is a plank with a slightly scalloped texture from the adze work, perfectly even in thickness, with every fiber of the grain running unbroken from end to end. Viking shipwrights often left faint adze marks on interior surfaces as a kind of signature of the craft. Those marks are not flaws. They are evidence that the wood was worked by hand, with the grain, the way it wanted to be worked. Let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that this tradition handles completely differently. The first pattern is reaching for the chainsaw mill by default. I did it. Most of us do. You drop a tree, and your first thought is how to saw it into boards. But sawing severs the grain, and for any application where you need strength and flex, a Riven plank will outperform a sawn board every single time. The second pattern is trying to split off-center. When you are eager and impatient, you eyeball the center and start swinging. But if your first split does not run through the pith, Everything after it will be asymmetrical, and your planks will be uneven in thickness with grain that runs out one side. The third pattern is using only iron wedges in green wood. I learned this one the hard way. Iron is slippery in wet fibers. Wooden gluts grip and hold. Start with wood. Finish with iron if you need the extra force. The fourth pattern is fighting a wandering split instead of steering it. Your instinct is to just hit harder, drive more wedges, force it straight. But force does not redirect a crack. Leverage does. Flex the thick side, reposition your wedge. Work with the physics instead of against them. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This one comes from a Norwegian boat builder I watched work a few years back, and I have never seen it in any book. Before he split a log, he would take a hand axe and make a shallow scoring cut across the end grain, right along the line where he intended his split to run. Then, he would watch where the surface fibers separated. If the tiny crack from that scoring cut ran straight and true along his intended line, he knew the split would follow. But if the scoring crack immediately veered left or right, he knew the internal grain was not running where he thought it was, and he would rotate the log and try a different angle until the scoring cut tracked true. It takes about 30 seconds, and it saves you from committing to a split that is doomed from the start. I have used this on every log I have riven since I learned it, and my success rate went from about 6 out of 10 to nearly every single one running clean. It is the kind of small, quiet trick that does not make for a dramatic video, but it will save you hours of frustration and a lot of wasted wood. Now, if this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, I have written a guide called Secrets of the Shipyard. It covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that have been perfected over centuries. The kind of stuff you will not find in most modern woodworking books. Scan the QR code right now or check the first link below. All right, let us wrap this up. Here is what I want you to take away from today. You do not need a sawmill to make planks. You do not even need electricity. What you need is a straight-grained log, a splitting axe, some wooden wedges, a beetle, and 3 edge tools to dress the surface. The Vikings built ships that crossed oceans with exactly that kit. Read the log, split it radially, use the right tools in the right order, steer the crack when it wanders, and dress the plank with hand tools that follow the grain. You will end up with stock that is stronger, more stable, and more beautiful than anything that ever came off a bandsaw. Thanks for sticking with me today. I will see you in the next one.